you guys can ask and I'll just go on for now. Budha is the next planet, Mercury. It rules Gemini and Virgo. And the constitution is Pitta, Vata, and Kapha. So Mercury is more, it's a eunuch. I didn't write it down. Mercury is a eunuch. And so Mercury tends to acquire the qualities of the planets that it is with. So Mercury is kind of like a chameleon. Mercury is the chameleon, and so he tends to blend in with his environment. So if he's with malefic planets, Mercury tends to become malefic. If he's with benefic planets, then Mercury becomes benefic. He tends to copy those around him. He's a good imitator. Mercury is a really good imitator. So he tends to be more, rather than original, he tends to be a really skillful in imitating and becoming whatever it is that he's influenced by.
Mercury is like a chameleon. It's the planet. The planet is like a chameleon. So, and it just acquires the other planet it is with, right?
Yes.
So, is it the same thing even if the Mercury is retrograde? Does it have to do with? I mean, will it be different if it is retrograde, or it doesn't matter how it is?
No, it does matter.
Oh, it does matter. Okay.
Yeah. So when planets are retrograde, then they tend to obsess about the qualities that they represent. Now, in the case of Mercury, if Mercury is retrograde and with another planet, then it tends to become obsessive compulsive about the qualities it represents and about the significations of the other planet, because it is influenced by that planet. So retrograde planets are strong. They're very strong because retrograde planets, they appear to be going backwards in the sky. They appear to have a backward retrograde motion. So when that happens, they're closer to the Earth. So in a chart, you can tell that a planet is retrograde. Of course, it'll say retrograde next to it. It'll have the R, or it'll be underlined or circled. But it's retrograde when it's opposite the sun. Generally, not Mercury and Venus, because they cannot be opposite. But for example, Mars and Saturn and Jupiter, when they're opposite the sun, they tend to be retrograde. Now, I don't know if that includes Jupiter, so I'm gonna have to research that part a little bit more. But basically, they're strong. They're very strong because they're closer to the Earth. So retrograde planets will obsess about anything that they represent. Like if Venus, for example, if Venus is retrograde, it'll tend to obsess about relationships, the person. If Mercury is retrograde, then the person tends to obsess about analyzing things, they obsess about their intellect, about getting things right, about discriminating, about organizing things in their mind, about just analyzing in general. So like Saturn, when Saturn is retrograde, then the person will tend to obsess about work, and they might become work addicts, for example. So the person will tend to display the quality of the planet, but in an over-the-top way. Like it's not just about working when Saturn, it's with Saturn, it's about healthy kind of working. You work and then you take a break, right? But when Saturn's retrograde, then it's over the top, like work. Like you tend to do the quality of the planet to the point of exhaustion. So in a way, that's the reason when it's retrograde, the negative aspect of it is, yes, it's strong, and yes, the planet you display the planet's qualities in a strong way, but it's in a way over the top. You indulge in those qualities. So it can become excessive. It can become an excessive kind of energy in your life. It can, take over your life sometimes if you're running that planet, for example. And Lindsay says, how long does retrograde last? Every planet is different. Okay, so for example, some planets are only retrograde for a short time. So Mercury usually tends to be retrograde 3 times a year and just for a few weeks, maybe 3 weeks or a month or something. Whereas Mars can be retrograde for 6 months at a time sometimes. And so I don't have all the planets in mind right now for how long they can be, but they vary also. Like Mars is not retrograde for 6 months all the time. It's retrograde. They just tend to vary. And so Mercury rules Wednesday, sense of smell, the color green, the north direction, brass and emeralds, libraries, bookstores, post office, parks, public assemblies, accounting offices, airports, transportation, business, and trade. And for the physical, it rules mind over body, skin, lungs, throat, nose, nervous system, ears, and memory. So when Mercury displays its positive qualities, it'll be dependable, service to others, honest, truthful, because Mercury has to do with speech. So the words that you communicate, Mercury is all about communication. And so the virtuous kind of Mercury will be honest, truthful, practical, intelligent, logical, analytical, discriminating, good education, good at math, good at astrology, because astrology is actually several planets represent astrology. Jupiter represents astrology, Mercury represents astrology, and then a couple of signs represent astrology. But Ketu represents astrology and Rahu as well. They all represent astrology for a different reason. So Mercury represents astrology in terms of the analytical aspect of astrology, in terms of compartmentalizing, putting things into categories, analyzing all those categories, and then being able to come up with a story. Whereas Jupiter represents astrology because astrology is higher wisdom. Astrology is giving light to someone's karma and being able to express that light. So it's wisdom. You're giving wisdom when you're talking about someone's chart to them, you're sharing wisdom about their karma. So that's why Jupiter represents. And then the 8th house has to do with astrology, because astrology shows you what's hidden, what's secret, what's beneath the surface of things. Because when you meet someone, you don't know everything about them, but astrology will give you their most hidden motives, their hidden thoughts, how they truly feel. Astrology will show that in a person's chart. So that's why the 8th house is astrology. And then Rahu and Ketu, those signify astrology also because it has to do with being unconventional. People who study astrology, they tend to be unconventional. Most of society doesn't really believe in astrology. So at least in the Western societies, there is a large group of people who do, and those tend to be unconventional people. They tend to be the people who are interested in the occult, which is another 8th house matter. Okay. So in terms of Mercury rules astrology, because with astrology you need to have a lot of calculations. Nowadays you don't need to do calculations because the computer software will do that for you, which is really nice. My teacher himself, James Kelleher, one of my teachers, but he actually used to calculate his teacher's charts by hand. He used to spend 12 hours a day in London, calculating by hand every single person's chart that his teacher did. And this was back in the 1970s and early 1980s. So he said that when astrology astrology programs started coming out, he was thankful. He's like, oh my gosh, thank God for these computer engineers, that they made these astrology programs, because now he didn't have to do that. So it's really nice. We can focus on directly on the person's chart, on the symbology, but you still have to do analysis. So the part of Mercury hasn't gone away. You don't have to do the hard work of calculating, but you still have to analyze a lot of things and then put it in one story. Now, the negative aspect of Mercury is dishonesty, being a liar, nervous tension. So when a person's always very jittery and they're very nervous and they're always on Red Bull, for example. That's nervous tension. Timid, scattered, ungrounded, too many interests, fickle, irresponsible, gossiper, communication, that's a communication thing, sly, manipulative, for service to other. So in a communication type of way, people can display these things. In a person's chart, Mercury will show how that person's intellect works. If they're able to analyze things and compartmentalize, or if they have to use more of their intuition to be able to do it. For example, if Mercury is with Mars, the person is quick. They'll analyze things quick, like just they'll get a flash of insight. Like they can do math in their head in a second. They can do very difficult calculations just in their head. So when Mars is with Mercury, it's actually a good combination, unless Mercury is afflicted in other ways. Like I said, 3 logs make a fire, because Mars is a malefic planet. If it's only with Mars, it only gives qualities of Mars. You have to have 3 logs to be afflicted. Now, when Mercury's with Saturn, for example, then the person tends to be more persevering. They tend to be better at research because they have patience, because Saturn is the planet of patience. They tend to be very careful. They tend to be careful with their words. They tend to speak more slowly, whereas Mars and Mercury together tend to talk very fast, like they'll say 100 words per minute or something. Whereas Saturn and Mercury together, they tend to be more deliberate in their speech, more cautious. They tend to analyze things. They have the patience to be methodical. So it's also a good combination when Saturn is with Mercury, because the person tends to be more careful, methodical, etc. And then when Mercury's with Venus, then the person tends to be very charming. Now, I think one of you guys unmuted yourself, because I'm getting a little bit of feedback. If you could just mute yourself. And Mercury shows the style of communication, which is something I was just talking about, how the person communicates. And it shows a special area of interest where the person seeks information. And Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo. Okay. And I'll go over the signs quickly here. The 3rd house, Gemini, rules the arms and the hands. the lungs. And the third house has to do with communication in general, writing, publishing, books, reading. But it's also willpower, sports, short journeys, libraries, initiation into spiritual techniques. So the third house has a Mercury aspect, but it also has a Mars aspect. The Mars aspect of the third house is the willpower, the courage, the bravery. And the Mercury aspect is the communication aspect. And Gemini people tend to be communication oriented. They won't be satisfied with just emotions. They need a partner to communicate with, to talk with. Logical, playful, sexual. If you look at the symbol for Gemini, it's two people embracing each other. So that could either be twins or it could be a couple in a romantic embrace. Gemini is curious also, so they have multiple talents. They can be good at a lot of things. Because they are very curious, it's an air sign, so their mind is working 100%, 24/7. They're always thinking about something. So these people are always in the mind, and that's why they get bored quickly. That's one of the shadow side of Gemini. They get bored very quickly because they want to learn something else. Like their mind is just so active. They're not satisfied with just learning one thing. So they can have too many irons in the fire. That can be a shadow side, that can be a negative side, because that means that they might not be able to stick with one subject long enough to master it. But if Gemini has stabling influences, if the person has a grounding influence, such as Saturn, for example, then they will be able to persevere to the end with the subject. So they need to have grounding influence. This Gemini person should have planets in earth signs to be able to have that grounding influence, to be able to balance this air quality that they have of being mental and being in the mind all the time. So that's one of the shadow sides, being scattered, being ungrounded.